Good afternoon, everybody, for this second panel of today. We are now having a panel that will be somehow celebrating the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and makes us reflect on these strategic islands, the Azores and the evolving Atlantic landscape. And we have 4 wonderful speakers with us. Due to the time, I will not give full presentations of their biographical notes. You have it on your folders. We have it on the website, so I invite you all to read it. But I will briefly just say who each of them is. So we will begin with Luís Rodrigues, who is a full professor from the History Department and a researcher from the Center for International Studies at ISCTE. Luís will talk about overcoming isolation, the importance of the Azores in the early Cold War. So Luís, with no further ado, thank you so much for being here, and go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much for your introduction, and Mónica. It is always a pleasure and an honor to return to Santa Maria. I believe some 18 years after my first conference here, and the initial invitation from António Monteiro to speak on a rainy November evening, if I'm not mistaken, in 2006. This year is also, it marks the 80th anniversary of the first modern Portuguese-American agreement regarding the Azores and Santa Maria, the agreement of November 1944. And it's very, since that distance conference, Santa Maria, LPAZ, and the other institutions involved have made an extraordinary work and placing these conferences on the map and placing Santa Maria at the center of the debate, not only about the past, but also about the future of the Atlantic. As an historian, however, my presentation will focus on the past, and what I will try to do in these brief minutes is to examine how the Azores played a crucial role in Portugal's efforts to overcome potential isolation in the aftermath of World War II, to secure international acceptance of the regime at that time, Salazar's dictatorship, and to integrate Portugal into the new international order after World War II, dominated, at least in the Western sphere, by the United States. And to explore this, I will structure my talk around 3 points. First, a brief contextualization of the crisis, or rather the multiple crises that the Portugal and the regime faced in the final years of World War II and the immediate post-war period. Second, I will narrow the focus to one particular aspect of this crisis, specifically its international dimension, and the looming threat of isolation, of international isolation for Portugal during that time. And finally, with an even sharper focus, I will examine the strategic importance, how the strategic importance of the Azores within the context of the emerging Cold War played a key role in overcoming this isolation. And therefore, I will pay special attention to the bilateral relations between Portugal and the US and the negotiations that led to several agreements on the Azores in the early years of the Cold War. So let me begin then with context. In the final years of World War II and the immediate post-war period, Portugal experienced a severe crisis that genuinely threatened the survival of Salazar's regime. While we know today that the dictatorship would last for another 30 years, this continuity was far from assured in the late 1940s. On the contrary, there were very clear signs suggesting that a political shift in Portugal could occur at any moment after World War II. First of all, Portugal was severely, I think I can, severely affected by the harsh economic and social consequences of World War II and the subsequent post-war crisis. Although the country did not participate in the conflict, and unlike much of continental Europe, it did not suffer the physical devastation of the war, the social and economic effects of World War II were acutely felt, particularly in terms of food shortages, the so-called subsistence crisis that afflicted much of the Portuguese population. So food was scarce in Portugal. The nation did not produce enough to feed itself, and despite emerging from the war with significant foreign reserves in money and gold, as the British ambassador put it, with full pockets but an empty stomach, there were difficulties in importing food. And these difficulties were due both to the scarcity of international markets and also to the very difficult winter of 1946, 1947, particularly harsh in terms of weather. These only exacerbated these difficulties, affecting both domestic agricultural production and also the international circulation of food products, and therefore the possibilities for import. So while it is true that this crisis was widespread and even more severe in other Western and Central European countries, in Portugal it was further aggravated by the country's already structurally lagging social and economic indicators, to say the least. Secondly, the regime was also threatened. Salazar's regime and the dictatorship was also threatened by what we can describe as an extraordinary wave of political and social activism that was felt in Portugal when the war ended. So despite this background, or because of it, this background of food crisis, many Portuguese experienced the post-war years, particularly the later half of the 1940s, as a period filled with great dreams and hopes. With the euphoria surrounding the victory of democracies, there was a widespread expectation of change regarding the political regime that had been in place since 1932 under Oliveira Salazar's leadership. There were also hopes for improved living conditions, both socially and economically. So for the youth, there was hope in building a more just society and securing a future that would allow the new generation to live in a more developed country, aligned with the democratic values that had won in World War II. For women, there was a hope for a future in which their rights, already recognized in other countries, would be also acknowledged in Portugal. For parts of the populations within the Portuguese Empire, colonial empire, there was also an expectation for a future that would involve the recognition of their human rights and also their civil rights, along with increased autonomy and emancipation for their peoples. So consequently, as soon as the war ended, Portugal entered one of the most intense periods of political and social mobilization in the history of Salazar's regime. From 1945 onward, opposition movements were organized, youth activism flourished, feminist associations advocating for women's rights and for peace took a stand. Discontented military officers tried to overthrow the regime and the government. Strikes and other forms of protests erupted among shipyard workers, agricultural laborers from Alentejo and Ribatejo regions, university students, professors. So there was this dimension of social and political unrest that was a significant danger to the regime. And the dictatorship responded to these social and political and military protests with its usual violence and repression. However, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, following the defeat of Nazism and fascism, it became more challenging for the regime, the Estado Novo, to employ the same methods it had used previously, and this shift led to the opening of this brief window of opportunity that allowed the surge of these activism that I just described. Third point, fourth point, against this background of economic crisis and social and political unrest, there also emerged a sense of disillusionment, doubts, and demobilization within the regime itself. So in the post-war years, divisions and fractures within the political structures of the regime deepened. Successive political crises, government reshuffles, even for a dictatorship, political uncertainties, changes in direction. Since the end of 1945 and even earlier, there were signs of discouragement and disbelief even in Salazar's leadership and the future of the regime. And this was visible at central, regional, local levels. All these developments we know were not enough to bring down the regime, but certainly called its survival into question and caused doubts and generate uncertainty about its future. Even more threatening, perhaps, was the fifth dimension, I guess, of the crisis, which is the focus of our discussion today, the fact that the regime still faced the specter of international isolation in late 1945 and during 1946. It was not certain that the allies who had just won the war were willing to accept Salazar's regime in Portugal. Although Portugal was not in the same situation as Spain, because in the final years of World War II, Portugal had engaged in what we can call collaborative neutrality, notably by allowing the Allies to use facilities in the Azores. But Portugal's name was often linked with Spain when evaluating the behavior of the Iberian dictatorships during the war. So the regime faced significant criticism from international public opinion, particularly from democratic and liberal circles and public opinion, and, for instance, saw its application for entry in the United Nations vetoed in 1946. And these held very serious political implications, potential implications for the regime's international isolation, and even provided some extra motivation for opposition movements, both politically and militarily. So throughout 1946, as you can see, Salazar and his regime faced a series of, let's say, negative developments internationally. In March, especially France, but also the UK and the US, issued a tripartite declaration condemning the Spanish government, considering Franco's regime as a silent partner of the Axis during the war. Then in the same month, the New York Times reported that the US Department of State was preparing an extensive dossier on Spanish conduct during the war. And these documents revealed that Salazar was also a sympathizer of the Axis, who had been, according to the New York Times, willing to fight against the British if they had invaded Portugal. Then July 1946, this cover of this highly critical article in the American magazine Time, which with a series of devastating observations about the living conditions in Portugal, and also very critical comments about the prevailing regime. Portugal was depicted as another European dictatorship, a fascist regime in which, and I quote, free thought had been abolished, the individual had become subordinate to the state, human rights were suppressed, and the secret police had become the principal arm of the government. This was on July 1946. August, so a few days later, Portugal submitted its application to for UN membership, and with the support of the US and the UK, but Portugal's application was met with negative vote from the Soviet Union, 5 minutes, and Poland. So Portugal would not enter the United Nations until 1955. And this is not an international development, but an internal development. In October 1946, an attempted military coup against Salazar. So this is where the importance of the Azores truly comes into play. So because one of the ways to somehow overcome this scenario of international criticism and isolation, particularly following the veto in the UN, was for Portugal to invest in bilateral relations, especially with the United States, in an effort to secure a minimum level of integration into the new international order. So it was in this pursuit of a kind of a parallel path, an alternative door to international acceptance, particularly through bilateral channels, that Salazar's regime found success, with the Azores playing a crucial role due to its strategic importance and due to the continued interest of the United States in maintaining a military base in the archipelago. In fact, for the US, and with the emergence of the Cold War, Portugal, and especially the Azores, gained a new strategic importance. And that was the main reason why the US decided to support the integration of Portugal into its own sphere of influence, and consequently the maintenance of the dictatorship in Portugal, with which, in fact, the US had already established a history of trust and successful negotiations since World War II. The Portuguese dictatorship's compliance with American requests, along with its strong anti-communist credentials, rendered the nature of the regime in Portugal largely irrelevant in the eyes of Americans and the British, and ultimately led the Portuguese dictatorship in 1949 to become a founding member of NATO, an alliance aimed at defending democracy and freedom. A dictatorship, founding member of an alliance to fight for democracy. And if you look at the chronology and the few dates that I put there, you can, in fact, see with more detail what happened. For instance, at the beginning of 1946, when criticism of Spain and the Franco regime was intensifying, and to some extent Salazar was being associated with Spain, the US requested in February an extension of the Santa Maria Agreement for 3 months, and Portugal promptly agreed. In May 1946, so a few weeks after the New York Times characterizations of Salazar as an Axis sympathizer, a new agreement was signed between Portugal and the US, extending the authorization for the use of Santa Maria and also Terceira, Lages, until December 1947. In July 1946, the month of the article in Time magazine, the Portuguese government released a set of official documents related to the Azores agreements of 1943 and 1944, showing to the domestic and international public opinion how Portugal had collaborated with the Allies since mid-1943. Or, for instance, in August 1946, shortly after Portugal had applied for the UN, the official visit of the 12th American Naval Squadron to Portugal, an event widely publicized and presented as an official proof of the friendship and cooperation between the two countries. So again, this bilateral relation with the US, largely driven by American interest in Santa Maria and Lages, after the British left Terceira Island, this was crucial for Portugal and Salazar's regime in this context of international difficulties. The regime used this proximity, this rapprochement, both domestically, essentially to counter the opposition's accusation that the Portuguese dictatorship was not accepted internationally, but also used it internationally to somehow compensate for the setback of not joining the UN. And in the following years, this trend would continue, but also in a different dimension. The integration of Portugal into the US sphere of influence, also on a multilateral level, through the invitation to participate in the Marshall Plan in 1947 and in NATO in 1949. So very briefly to conclude, just 3 points, 4 points, 5. First point, the regime created by Salazar in the early 30s faced its first serious crisis with the end of World War II, as I mentioned. This was a multi-level crisis, economic, social, political crisis. It coincided with a wave of social, political, and military activism that endangered the regime. Secondly, it is also important to understand how international difficulties were a significant factor in this crisis, and one of the main concerns for Portuguese leaders. The fear of potential international isolation of the regime, as well as the eventual pressures for political transformation in Portugal. These were major concerns for policymakers. And finally, this idea that the intensification of international tensions, the emergence of the Cold War were fundamental developments that ensured the survival of the dictatorship in Portugal. And this was due mainly to the strategic importance of the Azores. The onset of the Cold War, from the perspective of the United States, the onset of the Cold War prioritized national security and preparedness for potential conflict over political considerations or concerns regarding the type of regime in Portugal. So the Cold War would justify somehow, in the name of fighting communism, the US willingness to establish favorable relations and even support later on the emergence of dictatorial regimes elsewhere, as seen in the later 1960s and the 1970s in Latin America. Finally, one last point, some thoughts on the domestic consequences of these international developments, on the internal consequences of the beginning of the Cold War and of Portugal's integration into the so-called Western Bloc. The Cold War provided the regime with renewed legitimacy to intensify its repressive measures against Portuguese citizens involved in the post-war wave of social and political activism. So kind of a spirit of McCarthyism emerged in Portugal with this new Cold War context, characterized by the division between the two blocs. And this gave the regime a new pretext to escalate repressive actions, dismantling, arresting, suppressing workers and peasants, women and youth, as well as political and social activists and their organizations, under the argument that this activism was inspired by foreign, by Soviet, by communist elements. In part it was, but that's not the point here. And therefore, this activism constitutes a threat to national security that could not be tolerated in a country that was a founding member of NATO. And one last point, interesting one, and I'll just finish. The division of the world into rival blocs, highlighting also the growing divergence and opposition between Western democracy and Soviet communism, also exacerbated the divisions within the anti-Salazar opposition itself, ultimately undermining all efforts for unified action that had been developed since the final phase of World War II. Although these efforts for unity had a final surge in the presidential elections of 1949, but after that, reconciling viewpoints between democratic opposition and communist opposition became increasingly difficult, also due to the Cold War. Thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for extending the time.
Thank you so much, Luís Nuno. I'm sorry for this hard work, for this hard position that I'm into, but thank you so much for highlighting this and giving us this encompassing view of both the internal and external dimension of this emergency of Cold War and the World War II realities in Portugal in a way that it's not always seen. So I will now give the floor to Patrícia Denhardt, who is a senior researcher at the Portuguese Institute of International Relations from Nova University and also from the National Defense Institute. She will be talking about Portugal's 75-year NATO membership, the Azores Islands and the Transatlantic Alliance. So a follow-up from the Luís panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mónica, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. I must say it's my third time at this conference, and I see the audience, the numbers are growing, which is a wonderful sign. And speaking rightly after Luís Nuno, I think is quite fitting, because I'm going to speak about or take as a starting point Portugal's NATO membership and Portugal's entry into NATO as a founding member. So Portugal's security and defense policy up until this day is inseparable from its membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its alliance with the United States. For Portugal, a small country with its limited resources, but with a traditionally strategic global outlook, NATO has been and continues to be its central security and defense institution, and it confirms Portugal's international position at the center of the Euro-Atlantic area as, I would argue, an unambiguous and loyal member to the alliance. As one of NATO's founding members, NATO's 12 founding members, and the only non-democratic state, alliance membership has ever since been crucial for the Azores archipelago's strategic location in the center of the Atlantic, connecting Europe to the Americas, and because it has allowed Lisbon to develop a close security and defense relationship with the United States. In recent years, new actors and new challenges in the South Atlantic and the emerging geopolitical competition between the United States and China in the Euro-Atlantic area have reinforced, I would argue, the relevance of the Azores Islands for the United States and for the whole of the transatlantic alliance. And this, of course, has implications for the definition of Portugal's security and defense policy. And this is something I think Lisbon should capitalize on. And so my presentation today, and this is an article, an extended article I've written, so I'm really, I'll do it in a very quick fashion, and then I can develop some points in the Q&A. The presentation today will focus on questions of what interests Portugal has pursued in NATO during its 75-year membership, and how has Portugal contributed to the security of the Atlantic Alliance, and what role have the Azores specifically played in this new and more competitive international order. I would argue that Portugal's role as a NATO member can be divided basically into 4 phases. I'll go into these 4 phases with some development. The first one being the one that Luís Nuno has just developed and explained very well in terms of what preceded it. And this first phase is the phase between 1949 and 1974. So during the Estado Novo, Salazar regime, and what choices or what it meant for Portugal to be a NATO member. As one of the 12 founding members, membership was crucial because, as I mentioned, the Azores archipelago's geostrategic location in the middle of the Atlantic, and because it allowed Lisbon to develop a close security and defense relationship with the United States. During World War II, Portugal pursued a collaborative neutrality which provided the Allies access to the strategically important Azores Island in the North Atlantic. And by then, Portugal's traditional preference and alignment with the main maritime power, being Great Britain, had been enlarged to include the relationship with the United States. So to say, when the Pax Britannica became slowly substituted by the Pax Americana, this meant that Portugal sort of enlarged its privileged centuries-old relationship it had with Great Britain towards the United States, and this allowed the United States, through a treaty signed between Portugal and Washington in 1944, to install air and naval bases on the Azores archipelago. And after the war, the US was granted the continued use of military facilities at the Azores' largest air base through several defense agreements, the most important one being the one signed in September 1951. So indeed, I would argue that the strategic location of the Azores archipelago in the middle of the North Atlantic was actually the main reason why Portugal was invited into NATO. During the Cold War, the islands became a strategic asset for America's power projection and for the US forward defense as a logistics and refueling hub, and forward defense access for its European allies and the protection of allied countries such as Israel, for example, during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So despite being far away from the center of divided Europe, we're talking about the Cold War, Portugal became central to the security of Western Europe, given this geostrategic location on the southern shores of the Eastern Atlantic and the central location of the Azores archipelago in the center of the North Atlantic. From Lisbon's perspective, 4 years after the end of World War II, choosing to become a founding member of NATO in 1949 and having the possibility of becoming a founding member was crucial for Portugal for 4 reasons. First, NATO membership ended Portugal's international isolation and firmly embedded it into the Western Bloc in the emergent bipolar Cold War, as we've just heard from Luís Nuno. It gave Salazar somehow international legitimization for his political regime, as joining NATO as the only non-democratic founding member came to symbolize the near full rehabilitation of its regime in the post-Cold War, in the post-war order. And it ended these 4 years of Portugal's vulnerable period of international marginalization and uncertainty in its foreign policy between 45 and 49. And from the onset, Portugal, mainly or very much because of Salazar's anti-communist credentials, this became probably one of the main reasons why American presidents included Portugal in the new strategy of containment of Soviet communism. And then Salazar also used the regime's international legitimacy, to weaken domestic opposition forces, which were divided over NATO membership, with the Communist Party opposing it from the outset, whereas the democratic opposition was in favor of NATO membership, also because it saw it as a possible vehicle towards democratic transition. The second reason why NATO membership served Portugal's interests was that this membership embedded Portugal's new bilateral relationship with the United States in a new multilateral framework of collective defense of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So yes, it was certainly substantiated and based on the bilateral relationship between Lisbon and Washington, but this was embedded in a larger multilateral framework, and it set the parameters for Portugal's post-war Euro-Atlantic foreign policy. Third reason was that NATO membership certainly contributed also to the modernization of the Portuguese armed forces. Being a member of NATO allowed Portugal to not be on the forefront of industrial military development, and certainly to adapt its military infrastructure or try to adapt it to alliance standards. And this was certainly also one positive, if one could say, outcome that sustained, an important outcome that sustained the regime. And fourthly, the option for NATO membership, and Luís Nuno has hinted at this as well, was that it differentiated Portugal's foreign policy from Spain's foreign policy. While Salazar initially was in favor of having Spain join NATO at the same time, in believing that this would increase Portugal's diplomatic leverage, he soon realized that only Lisbon joining would actually mean that Portugal could increase rather than diminish its international status. And furthermore, it ensured that the Iberian Peninsula was not treated as a single strategic space, but rather as two separate strategic entities with their own interests. And this allowed Portugal to claim its role as NATO's central southern maritime power, whereas Spain's role would then be seen more as a continental power. And this line of thinking, I think, has been one of lines of continuity in terms of allowing Portugal a bigger margin of maneuverability of stating its own identity within NATO. The second phase of Portugal's NATO membership began with the 1974 Nations Revolution and with Portugal's transition towards democracy. This consolidated Portugal's anchorage in NATO and cooperation between domestic post-authoritarian political forces and the United States and the Federal Republic of Germany prevented a neutralist drift or a change in Lisbon's foreign policy orientation, either towards a neutralist stance or towards even a pro-Soviet stance. And this was important because at the time, especially during the revolutionary period, there was divergence between four political factions: the neutralists, the Africanists, the Europeanists, and the Atlanticists. All viewed Portugal's post-Estado Novo foreign policy as having these possible avenues. And at some point, the reaction from the United States was even to consider the possibility, and here I'm speaking of the Ford administration and of Henry Kissinger, who at some point even considered the independence, the political independence of the Azores, and it took some political back and forth diplomatic maneuvering, also with some intervention of Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who at some point met with Kissinger in Brussels, and argued that there was no reason, they did not see in 1975 a reason for considering this independence. And the US ambassador Frank Carlucci then also played a crucial role in convincing the American and a skeptic Henry Kissinger that Portugal was worth fighting for, was not in that sense, was worth to certainly maintain its status as a valuable strategic partner of the United States. Fast forward, the third phase of Portugal's NATO membership, and which I will not go into, began with the end of the Cold War, when Portugal and all NATO allies adapted to a different international environment, an environment where there were international interventions, where Portugal and other members participated. And this was a period when NATO adopted several or three new strategic concepts. And this phase led then into a fourth phase, which is a phase which I would argue we are in now, and which is a phase which began in the mid-2010s, if one could put it like that. This, when the alliance felt out of NATO area interventionism fatigue, I would argue, when this whole idea NATO has to intervene in Afghanistan, has to play a role in Iraq and go to other areas, when there was a Western fatigue with this policy. Secondly, when Washington decided to pivot to Asia or to the Indo-Pacific. And thirdly, when Moscow began to have a much more offensive foreign policy, when it intervened in the civil war in Syria, and of course, when it annexed Crimea in 2014. At this time, however, and of course, things don't happen separately from one another, this US pivot to Asia and the US position regarding Portugal's strategic importance for NATO assets at this time began to change. 2012, 2013, 2015, concretely here on the Azores Islands, was when the US had already announced and was turning into effect a certain diminishment of the importance of its asset. The number of personnel at the largest air base was diminished significantly. The US had around 3,000 soldiers stationed during the Cold War. By now, the number was around 180 personnel. The American school closed in large on Terceira Island, closed in 2015. So to say, the American involvement significantly diminished. And this, of course, had an impact on Portugal's standing within the NATO alliance, and especially also in its bilateral relationship with the United States. However, in recent years, and I'm getting to the final point of the presentation, the course of diminishment or decline of the country's relevance as a NATO operational hub, and especially the strategic importance of the Azores, however, seems to be reverting in the last couple of years, and mainly for three reasons. First, as I just mentioned, Russia's more offensive actions and its revisionism in the Euro-Atlantic era produced the unintended consequence of a possible revaluation of the largest airfield's strategic importance to the US, given NATO's strengthening of deterrence and defense in allied territory. Of course, the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine is an additional argument that speaks in favor of increasing the importance of the Azores archipelago as a whole, and as a terceira island in concrete. Secondly, the increase of challenges and risks in the domain of maritime security and in NATO's southern neighborhood are likely to increase as well the relevance of Portugal's geostrategic location as a whole, and the Azores in particular. We know that the maritime security has many domains in terms of the challenges posed by illegal migration, fishing, drug trafficking, terrorism, piracy, armed robbery at sea, and hybrid means of warfare, and also the question of the protection of critical infrastructure, subsea cables, is another relevant area where we know that the Azores can play an increasing role. On the other hand, security challenges on NATO's southern flank, as we've just seen at NATO's recent Washington summit, Portugal has insisted, together with other southern European countries, but Portugal here played an important role in insisting that NATO should adopt a strategy, or at least a position vis-a-vis NATO's southern neighborhood, and where questions again of illegal migration, human and drug trafficking, organized crime, but basically just the difficulty of leading, of handling the situation of irregular migration certainly poses for the southern members of the NATO alliance a serious challenge. And the third reason, and I'll finish with this, why Portugal's relevance as a NATO hub, and especially the strategic importance of the Azores, is bound to increase, is China's growing global assertiveness and its growing rivalry with the United States. This is reflected in these countries' foreign policies vis-a-vis Portugal. And we've seen that over a decade ago, China has revealed a growing strategic interest in establishing a presence in the Azores Islands. We've also seen this with the port in Sines. There's also this strategic interest in arguably only pursuing commercial interests in that area, but we've also seen China's increased influence in trying to get a footprint in the telco industry, in the Portuguese telco industry. But regarding the Azores Islands, it is significant that once the US has announced its diminished involvement, China has immediately attempted to fill the strategic vacuum, the strategic void, and argues that it wants to pursue interests in the Terceira Island for economic reasons, also for scientific and cultural partnership reasons. So to conclude, I'll finish just with this point, this argument. It's not because we're here on the lovely island of Santa Maria that I would argue in that sense. I have to say, actually, my field of expertise is much more Germany's foreign policy, but I think NATO's growing importance because of Russia, but also because of the US-China increased competition, make it for the argument that Portugal's geostrategic location, but especially the Azores Islands, will play an increasing role in this rivalry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And sorry for overstepping.
That's okay. It's within the margin the margin of error. Thank you so much, Patricia, for having for bringing NATO and Portuguese participation in NATO until nowadays. We are now going to zoom out a little bit and recenter, like Pedro Seabra talk, is supply and demand, recentering the multilateral debate on the Atlantic. So let's zoom out into the whole of the Atlantic. Pedro Seabra is an assistant professor at the history department of ISCTE and also a researcher at the Center for International Studies. Pedro, thank you so much for being here. I will give you the floor and I will warn you at 5 minutes.
Please,
and then,
please do.
And then warn you as many times as
Warn me as
necessary.
much as you can. Thank you very much, Mónica. Of course, I want to start by thanking the organizers. Unfortunately, I haven't been here for the last 18 years. Nor it's even my third time. It's actually my first time in the island, but I'm enjoying it very much, and I hope to come back further and additionally in the future. So as Mónica just mentioned, I think both Luís, Nuno, and Patricia set the stage and they zoomed in on specific dynamics, which are, I think, of course, of interest for Atlantic dynamics and for Portugal and for the role of the Azores. But I really want to zoom out and I want to focus on some things that I've worked in the past. And I used this conference basically to try and revisit some past arguments that I made with some of my work and trying to revisit and potentially update it a bit. And the overall aim here is really to discuss how exactly we can discuss the context of the Atlantic ecosystem from a multilateral point of view, and which solutions have been brought forward, which ones have failed, and what exactly overall are the challenges that we are bound to keep on facing from this perspective. But before going into the Atlantic, I think we have to, of course, this one, no, this one, not this one, and this one. Here we go. Awesome. Perfect. And of course, I think we have to begin by addressing the big elephant when trying to make big statements over the state of any multilateral solution, be that in the Atlantic or any other part of the world. And in that sense, we are very easily faced with this constant and repeated narrative that multilateralism as a whole, in general, is in crisis. And actually, as I was putting this PowerPoint, preparing this PowerPoint, I just noticed that if you begin from top to bottom, you actually see the full stages of the narrative behind this crisis in multilateralism. First, you begin by asking, is multilateralism in crisis? Then you go down and then you just assert, yes, it is now in crisis. Then you realize it's a long crisis by now. And then you start asking, can it be saved? And then you go full circle and you actually, is it really in crisis though? And I think this sort of encapsulates a bit the contradictions that we often hear when talking about this kind of concepts. And I think there are a lot of problems behind it. There are a lot of reasons why we tend to easily adopt this kind of narrative. But one of them might probably be an issue of the concepts that we use when talking about multilateralism, right? And in that sense, I think it is always useful to go back to basics and with John Ruggies in 1992 definition of what exactly is multilateralism. And it's a very boring definition to be sure, but one that allows us to encapsulate quite a lot of what happens in the world around us. So we see multilateralism, or we should perceive multilateralism as an institutionalized form of coordinating relations between three or more states on the basis of generalized principles of conduct. And of course, as many of you know for sure, or might actually be tempted to do, you easily or more quickly use the term of multilateralism when talking about the UN or big international summits and gatherings. And of course, if we were to stick just by that, of course, we would be led to believe that it is, if not in a permanent state of crisis, but in a near permanent state of crisis, which then would also force us to adapt that kind of narrative. However, I would argue, and I'm not the only one by any means, that instead of just assuming full on that multilateralism overall in general in crisis, we have to actually be a bit more specific, and we actually have to unpack a bit all these different dynamics that we are witnessing all around us. And so we should probably start by admitting that what we are seeing right now is actually new and different trends in multilateralism. So we are starting to see more minilateral mechanisms rather than universal ones. We are starting to see more disaggregated ones instead of just thematically comprehensive. We are also witnessing more transgovernmental mechanisms rather than just intergovernmental ones, more regionally targeted instead of a more global purview, such as the UN, for example. And of course, with more multiple actors at various levels and not just this very old and dated state-centric view. And of course, constituted bottom-up instead of just top-down. And so overall, instead of just claiming that we are facing a crisis in multilateralism, perhaps we would be better served by admitting that we are facing a more complex and more diversified type of multilateralism in the current stage. However, another trend that is not on this list, and which was one that I've been working on quite a lot in the last few years, and just personally, I find it very interesting and puzzling, is this idea that instead of seeing more formal multilateralism, what we are now starting to see is actually more informal multilateralism, or examples of informal multilateralism. But what exactly is that? If we want to make that simple yet very meaningful distinction between informal and formal, we also need to be very precise in terms of what we are trying to look for, and even not just in the Atlantic, but worldwide. And so there's 3 dimensions that the burgeoning literature has started to advance right now. And in that sense, we really need to focus first and foremost on an explicitly shared expectation over purpose. So a certain group, a collective, needs to be bound by a certain goal that binds them together, yet they avoid putting that on paper in terms of a formal treaty. So from an international public law point of view, that is in existence. Secondly, you have to be able to identify explicitly which member states, or which are the members. They don't need to be states, but they need to be very explicitly defined. You cannot just pick and choose in terms of coming and going and participating in this initiative. No, they have to be there, and they have to be easily identified. And lastly, there has to be some regularity in terms of their workload, but at the same time, that regularity cannot be nothing very meaningful. And the best example in terms of institutionalization, and the best example is that this kind of governance mechanisms avoids having any kind of headquarters, for example, or permanent secretariats. They avoid any kind of meaningful binding institutionalization steps. And this, of course, has been already documented by colleagues of mine in recent years, depending on the database that you use to account for the number of informal mechanisms worldwide. You actually see a rise over the last 20 years. So starting in 2000, there's a more, depending on which database you use it, but there's a clear steep increase in the number of informal mechanisms that have been put forward. And so this has been going on. That should be my first point. So it's not as if suddenly informalism is here. It's not scary, and it's not certainly here to scare us, but we should perhaps pay a bit more attention to its existence and perhaps its contribution to this kind of debate. Wait, here you go. So how can we apply all this to the context of the Atlantic? And I think here, Patricia just made me a very good service with laying out the case of NATO, and I'll put a pin on that, and we can address it in the Q&A for sure, mostly because I think NATO in this case, or in this kind of discussion, is really an extreme case that needs to be set aside. But if we look more closely to this context of the Atlantic and go beyond geographic borders and this notion of the North and South Atlantic, we come to terms with 2 ideas. First and foremost, the length and the geography that it's at bay in terms of the space that is accounted for between North and South, East and West. And it's at the same time the presence or the existence of NATO, which sort of obfuscates or hinders any attempt that we might want to try to adopt to see beyond that. So we are very easily led to just focus on NATO as a prime example of multilateralism in this space. And I would argue that perhaps if we pull the veil out, we actually can find a lot of very interesting, not necessarily meaningful, but still interesting cases of multilateralism in this space. And so my idea for this discussion today was really to make a very quick overview of some of these examples that I've worked on and off for the last few years, and trying to extract some common lessons and some common notions that might actually lead us to talk about an Atlantic informal environment. And so there's 4 examples that I've selected for today. Again, I won't go into much detail on each of them. Each of them could warrant a presentation on their own. But I actually select them because even though they are very distinct amongst each other, they also, as I will explain, share quite a lot of common traits from a multilateral point of view. So for the point of this presentation, I basically picked up the Zone of Peace and Cooperation in the South Atlantic, which has been essentially a Brazilian-led project since the mid-80s, on and off, with different periods of activity, which has been characterized by a clear and distinct view of what exactly the Atlantic should be and who should not be part of. And secondly, the G7++ Friends of the Gulf of Guinea, which has been essentially focused on countering piracy issues in the Gulf of Guinea, and which has attracted not only Atlantic states or Atlantic actors, but also actors and states beyond the Atlantic and even beyond the Gulf of Guinea itself. And more recently, I also found it interesting to bring these other 2 initiatives, which are very much in their early stages of conception and inception. But the Partnership for Atlantic Cooperation, which has been one of the pet childs of the Biden administration for the Atlantic, but which is essentially a very informal approach to try and present this common framework on how to bring different parts of the Atlantic together at the same stage with US leadership and with US funding. And lastly, the Atlantic Initiative, which is even much more up in the air than the other ones, but which has been presented and put forward by Morocco, and which also very much tries to present a very benign and innocuous view of how you can interact with one another from a state point of view within the Atlantic context. And so if we look at the track record of all this very under-publicized experiments, we can actually extract a couple of key features that I would argue allow us to talk about this overall Atlantic informal context. The first one is that there is a very clear aversion from side to side within the Atlantic to excessive formalization ties. You won't see necessarily you won't find any new international organization of the kind in the last few years, precisely because most states have avoided putting all their eggs in one basket or becoming too attached to one single multilateral solution. Therefore, informality to them is perceived as a more beneficial approach and one which could pay off more dividends for their own national interests. Secondly, most of these different mechanisms that you kind of see populating the Atlantic, even though they are presented to the public, even though they have beautiful summits and ministerial meetings, and sometimes they put out very lengthy declarations, when you actually go into the detail of what they do, you actually find a very irregular pattern of activity within their yearly workload, so to speak. And so irregularity of what exactly they do and what they deliver to their state members is also, I would argue, a key feature in this debate. The third one is that they actually seem to multiply one against the other, meaning that they tend to focus on the same issues. For example, maritime security is always at the top of the agenda, but even more broader concerns over the conservation and protection of the oceans and fighting against the impact of climate change, for example, in the oceans as well. There seems to be a multiplicity of supply regardless of previous initiatives in that regard, in that sense, meaning that they don't necessarily take into account what has been put forward in the past, and they keep on multiplying on top of one and the other. And finally, there's this very clear and distinct dependency on every one of these initiatives on financial and logistical support, either from a regional paymaster or from an international organization. But you see that they are very clearly dependent on something else beyond the structure, the informal structure that was put together to solve one issue or the other. Wait, let me go. Yeah. So a couple of key lessons that I think we can take from analyzing the overall Atlantic context. On the upside, because there are good things to talk about all this, is that you see expedience of context, of sharing information. Informality allows for the quickness of context between each constitutive part. Secondly, modularity, meaning that you can, informality allows you to focus on specific topics and themes, and you don't get yourself bogged down by other concerns that are only very thinly connected to what you are trying to focus. In turn, modularity allows for compartmentalization in the sense that a couple of states might have different disputes, different divergences of interests, but for the sake of a specific topic that they might have benefits in working together, they will put those disputes aside and compartmentalize. And inclusivity, in the sense that informal mechanisms allow to go beyond just state members and to include other international organizations, and even, of course, more down-the-wire kind of actors, civil society, private sector, etc. But then, of course, there's the downside of informality, because even though it might sound very rosy and very beneficial to just go the informal route, the fact is when states invest too much on informality, what you actually see is very sudden and clear bursts of activity, peaks of activity in those mechanisms, followed very shortly, just a short while after the fact, by paralysis or hibernation of those mechanisms. And so informality does not necessarily guarantee that there will be results or outcomes to speak of or to show off. Secondly, there will also be a difficulty in assessing the work or the results of those mechanisms. Because it's so informal, there's not exactly much that you can compare with, or in terms of checking if the goals and the objectives and the agenda behind such informal mechanism is actually being enforced. And that, of course, can lead to problems of knowing whether or not it really pays off to go the informal route. And lastly, foreign shopping. So states will, of course, choose to go or choose to adopt or to join an informal mechanism according to their own specific interests. And those specific interests might be a couple today, but tomorrow might vary and be completely different ones the day afterwards, which means that they will not feel necessarily bound to stick with informal governance mechanisms just because they joined them in the first place. And just finishing. So a couple of open-ended conclusions, because I really don't want to finish on or settle this possible discussion. The first point that I would like to leave open-ended is really that amid this supposed crisis of international multilateralism, I think we have to be a bit more thorough and trying to open a bit more the box of possible multilateral experiments and consider less formal alternatives that I would argue have received less public scrutiny in the last few years. And then when we come to the context of the Atlantic, what we see is that this continuous supply of informal solutions has corresponded directly to the growing demand for alternative / outside of the box solutions, which tells us that states overall seem very much keen on continuing to go down this route. And I would end with just one very final provocation that I left just this morning in the PowerPoint, but which I think might lead us to think of how exactly we can perceive the Azores in this case, or even other potential countries and areas of interest, which is if this continuing supply of informal solutions keeps on rising and states keep on demanding more and more different informal mechanisms that will eventually overlap one over the other, then eventually our focus will turn from unpacking the crisis of international multilateralism to actually pinpointing and identifying possible intermodal nodes that allow to disentangle those mechanisms. And I would argue, or perhaps I would leave for the Q&A for anyone who's interested to know my thoughts on that, that perhaps the Azores might be a possible node in that regard. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Another sentence that I keep on saying during when I'm sharing sessions is that I'm a lousy moderator because I can never keep order in the speakers. But still, I will go forward with it. So last but definitely not least, we have Tomé Ribeiro Gomes, who is concluding his PhD dissertation in the PhD program on history, security studies, and defense at ISCTE. He's also an assistant researcher at the Center for International Studies. He will be bringing us how to operate this new multilateral scenario that Pedro has just zooming in again in the operative way. And his talk will be making the most of in-betweenity, the diplomatic potential of islands. Tomé, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the motivation for my thesis, because I do need it. In the interest of saving time, I'll try to keep this short and maybe skip some conceptual stuff. But what I'm looking at is the diplomatic potential of islands, looking at the Azores and the history of the Azores as a case study for this. Because in island studies, there's kind of a blind spot. Maybe there's some authors that consider strategic islandness, but I think there should be more work on this. And in strategy, in general, there's a tendency to look at military strategy, which we did today. But even in Professor Luís Rodrigues' presentation, and then Patricia Deinhardt, you saw that military strategic interest can be used in diplomatic ways. So the way Salazar used the interest of other powers in the military sense in the Azores played out diplomatically in the Luso-American relationship and then the multilateral setting that came in 49 with NATO. But island studies doesn't consider this much, which is strange because island studies looks a lot at how islands are represented. So how islanders feel about islands, how outsiders see islands. And I think the connection which hasn't been done is because when we look at diplomacy and scholars looking at diplomacy, there's a question which doesn't show up much, which is strange, which is the importance of where diplomacy is conducted. So the physical setting, the geographical setting for diplomatic talks. And this is weird because we know diplomats and states to wrangle, to be very much in the throes of discussions, of hot-tempered discussions about where these meetings will take place, especially high-level meetings. And I'm looking especially at high-level meetings, both bilateral and multilateral. There's even instances of discussions over the shape of the table in some instances. So you know this matters. And there are some authors which do look at how discussions about where diplomacy takes place develop. And there's two typologies that I've been able to find about where the solution which is found. So where are we going to meet for our high level, for our summits, okay? So there's Salacuse and Rubin, who is in a 1990 article, say that there's this difficult question which usually doesn't get asked in these settings, in political settings, usually in other settings, which is your place or mine, right? Usually happens in other settings, but there's 4 ways to answer, and it's either my place, your place. For my generation, it would be my parents' place or your parents' place. But so there's my place, there's your place, there's no place, you can have virtual summits, and with COVID, we had a democracy summit hosted by Joe Biden, well, hosted because it was virtual. And there's another place. So we ask someone else to be the host, some other place other than our respective countries to host our talks. And it matters because there's a perceived advantage in hosting the talks in your place when it's a bilateral and maybe a hostile or a tense bilateral exchange. If you can host the meeting in your country, you can control some parameters. You can control the theater, the drama, the visual elements of the negotiation when it's public. And there's also a symbolic gain that you have here, where it seems that you have the upper hand because you were able to make the other come to you. And symbolism, of course, matters a lot in diplomacy, which is a highly ritualized, very symbolic milieu. And so these solutions, no place, usually only happens when it's low-level stuff. So you'll not have a summit, an online summit, unless you have COVID, for example, going on. Otherwise, you'll go for another place. You'll meet somewhere else. And now we turn to the other typology, which finesses this fourfold typology. And this typology was proposed by Henriksen. And it gives us more than 10 places or category, ideal type places. So you have my place, your place, no place again. But then you have neutral places, which has to do with formal neutrality. So we're thinking Switzerland, we're thinking Malta. There's our places, where over a series of summits you alternate. So one summit in my country, another summit in your country. There's halfway places, where you try to meet at the border. So ideally, the idea behind this, Henrik says, it's the idea of equidistance. So we'll try to meet at an equidistant place between our countries' capitals, but because this is difficult to put in practice, it'll end up being a symbolic substitute, so a border, for example. There's the metropolitan places, cities with long tradition of diplomacy like Geneva, or at the European level, Brussels, today New York. You have demonstration places, which I won't go into for reasons of time. You have everyone's places, you have dangerous places, you have safe places, and you have exotic places, which are places imbued with a certain mystery, okay, which allows hosts to direct the attention of diplomats or the public to certain issues. And what I think, by trying to put together the island studies literature with these typologies, what I think ends up happening is islands serve as both exotic places and halfway places, because they function as borders. So there's an author, reader, who talks about border waters. So we talk about borderlands, but border waters are just as important. It's only that we're not used at looking at the international scene from the sea, so from the oceans. We're used to the continental bias of traditional IR theory and a lot of geopolitics. So in these border waters, you can meet. And looking at the Azores, we would have transatlantic, so someone from one margin of the Atlantic, someone from the other margin, meeting at the Azores. And then you'd have the special place element, which is a term used in island studies literature, which conveys the symbolic meanings which you want to convey, so via the exoticness of the exoticism of the place. So, bringing this to the Azores, the first, in the 20th century, the first instance that I could find, and I'm sure that there are more, is in 1906. And you have the naval arms race going on, so the tensions which will eventually lead to World War I. And in 1906, he had been the acting Secretary of State, US Secretary of State until recently, so Francis B. Loomis suggests to President Theodore Roosevelt that they should convey a great power summit. So all the great powers, Japan, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, they should convey them, and the place he proposes is the Azores. Theodore Roosevelt dismisses this. We're looking at a time where presidents aren't supposed to have such a strong external activity, so he doesn't want to appear overbearing as president, which is a charge he usually got. So it doesn't pursue this. Then what you have is about 30 years later, so in 1936, you have his cousin, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been in the Azores as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1918. So he'd been to San Miguel and to Fayal, and so during World War I. And he's got paintings of the Azores, at least 2 paintings of the Azores, at least one of them in the White House. Much later, he'll mention to Salazar his visit to the Azores when he's trying to comfort Salazar about American influence in the Azores. Luís Rodrigues has written about this. And he apparently thinks about the Azores a lot. So we'll talk now about a few instances where Franklin Roosevelt brings up the Azores as a solution, both an exotic place and a halfway place. So in 1936, he's thinking about convening world leaders such as Hitler, Mussolini, the Russian Tsar, the French and British prime ministers. He's thinking of bringing them together off the Azores. So this is from the memoirs of Canadian Prime Minister, longtime Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. And he says off the Azores, so this would be maybe aboard ships, and to try to resolve the tensions which we know are going on in 1936. Then in 1938 again, Mackenzie King again has a conversation where FDR again brings up the Azores. And the idea here was, an author says, was possibly to try to not to provoke isolationist elements in US politics, so try to avoid have a summit either in the US or in a traditional diplomatic capital, such as Geneva, for example. And the project is a bit different. He wants to bring small and neutral nations together, only then bring in the great powers. And Neville Chamberlain will say no to this. Winston Churchill will say this was the loss of the last frail chance to save the world from tyranny, otherwise than by war. And that Churchillian turns of phrase. Then in 1944, you have the idea of the UN. So Franklin Roosevelt wanted a peripatetic UN. So he wanted the United Nations to be always held, the Assembly General to be held at a different place every year. This isn't practical, so he ends up zooming in on 2 places to have the permanent bits of the new institution which is being planned, and these are the Azores and Hawaii. So his projects are either Flourish or the Flourish Island, which apparently had a big place in his imagination, or Niihau, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, in Hawaii, the Hawaiian island. Again, in 1945, we have another idea from Franklin Roosevelt, which is to have a kind of a multipolar UN, so to have a decentralized UN, and each region would deal with its own problems. So the Azores, I'm quoting, the Azores to address European affairs, Canada for North American, Hawaii for Pacific matters. So Mackenzie, this is again from a conversation with Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister. He ends up dissuading Franklin Roosevelt from this due to the practical and logistical challenges involved. And this, again, Franklin Roosevelt brings up Flores Island here. Then you have, I'm going to skip this. So you have 2 other instances, and then you come to one which actually happened. So it's not just a suggestion, which is in 1971, when Nixon decides to close the gold window for domestic reasons, so remove the dollar peg of the international monetary system. This is one of the main events in probably in the history of the second half of the 20th century. So it basically removes the floor from the monetary system in order to be able to devalue the US dollar, and then he has to convince the European partners to revalue their currency so that the dollar actually devalues. And he starts by working on Pompidou, so the French, And they decide to meet in the Azores. So again, halfway place. So in 71, there's the Nixon-Pompidou summit in Terceira. It's Terceira because of the advantage of the Lajes base, so an element of safe place here for the US. And this is interesting because it gives Caetano a very good opportunity to have some face-to-face bilaterals with Nixon and with Pompidou. He had outstanding issues with both, especially with Nixon, because the Lajes agreement had been suspended, or it was a gentleman's agreement since the 60s, since Kennedy. Sorry, I'm going a bit fast, but try to leave some space for the Q&A. Nixon comes away from this conference very happy, and you can actually hear in the Nixon tapes, you can hear the conversations with Kissinger, and Kissinger is doing what he does best, which is assuage, massage Nixon's ego. So they propose the idea of Azores doctrine, which is that countries should be able to manage their monetary affairs much as they manage their security affairs. This obviously didn't stick, the Azores doctrine moniker. And lastly, just to close, we had the Lajes summit, which gained a lot of controversy because this was about invasion of Iraq. And I'm going to finish here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It
We'll leave
worked.
it for Q&A.
I was not expecting just an overall. Okay, thank you so much, Tomé, for that. Now I have asked Her Excellency, the State Secretary, for 5 minutes for just a quick Q&A, if you allow us. So I would not like to end this panel without having a discussion. So I would like to open the discussion to the audience. Do you have questions for this panel? Please let us hear it. Okay, Sandra, aqui, thank you. Chris there, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I just would like to ask two questions to Luís and to Pedro. I would like to know a little bit more about the perspective of Luís about the veto of Poland, namely of Poland, to Portugal entry in the United Nations. And I would like to ask Pedro about his perspective on this informal multilateralism. How do you see that option vis-a-vis sovereignty, and namely within the reality of Azores, and how somehow to secure for the Azores the resources that exists? How can we deal and somehow balance those somehow informal multilateralism possibilities, and at the same time assure that what is from the Azores remains to the Azorean people and for the benefits of the Azorean people? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I actually have questions for everyone, but I'll just narrow it down to one person and catch people later on this. In fact, for Pedro, just wanted to ask, with these informals, do they not institutionalize because they can't? In other words, the issues divide them and they can't formalize it. It's just better to keep it as it is, or because they don't want to, because it serves purposes, reduces constraints?
Thank you so much. Any more questions? Okay, I will say it through here. So, Luís, Nuno first, and then
Sure.
Pedro. Yes.
Thank you, Sandra, for your question. Actually, the veto was from the Soviet Union. Poland voted against because it was a non-permanent member. I actually have the call here. Negative votes from USSR and Poland, abstention from Australia, and votes in favor of Portuguese entry in the UN. Mexico, China, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Egypt, and the Netherlands. So the veto was from the USSR, and my reading, well, not only mine, but my reading is that this was already a clear sign of that the Cold War was setting in, and it was impossible this was late August 1946 to have any kind of agreement, as the one that we would have later on in December 1955, when there was this package where several Eastern European countries and Western European countries like Portugal and Ireland, I believe Spain as well, I'm not sure, in 1955 they were, but this was in 1955. It was kind of a first period of détente after Stalin's death, but not in 1946. Internationally. Domestically, the regime in Portugal presented this veto as a sign of, almost as a sign of pride. It was an honor for Portugal to be vetoed by the Soviet Union, because it was a clear proof to anyone who had any doubts that Portugal was on the side of the West, and that was the speech. But of course, was as I mentioned in part of my presentation, it was concern for the regime, the veto, and then those alternative ways of integration were developed. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pedro.
Yes, thank you both for the questions. Let me start with Sanders. So I think we have to recognize here, and all this discussion about informality, is that informality only works to a certain point, right? I mean, it serves the point of certain states to go down the informal route because it is less costly, less timely, because it allows you to aggregate different partners that otherwise you would not be able to, and because there might be certain historical considerations to take into account, which doesn't allow you to go down a more formal path. But then if you really, informality allows you to muster support, it allows you to muster resources, it allows you to muster public attention even. But if you really want to lock down outcomes, if you really want to be ensured that certain things will prevail over time and that they will not flow away or they will not just disappear, then eventually we start talking about the need to take the next step, which is to, in some ways, formalize certain things. And then we get into a certain hybrid discussion in which it's not just formal international organizations, it's when informal international organizations suddenly start adopting formal steps in order to ensure that they don't disappear or they don't enter into hibernation. In the case of the Azores, for example, this could perhaps be applicable in terms of the preservation of natural maritime resources. On one hand, informality might allow you to, for example, what was behind the constitution of the Air Center, which initially was very much an informal push that eventually was sort of formalized in the sense that it has an headquarters, has a beautiful website, but not and promotes quite a lot of projects. But so my simple answer would be eventually you are required to take the next step and pursue some sort of formalization. Otherwise, you just open yourself to be exposed to the different fluctuation of interests from your participating member states. And in terms of Chris's question, I think the easy cop-out is both. So depending on each case, there have been both instances in time in which the leading states were not able to push forward with more grandiose, formalized ventures. That was very much the case with Brazil and Zopacas in '86, and that was very much the case with the US 2 years ago, when they recognized that their intents for the Atlantic would not be met with a grand, overarching, formal framework. And therefore, they came to the realization that going down the informal route at least allowed them to have a stake in the game, and at least allow them to conduct and lead the discussions. At the same time, when we unpack this kind of experiments, we also see that these same leading states sometimes just don't have the time, the resources, or the patience to even go down a more formal route. It takes time to go through Congress with constituting a new international organization. It takes time to corral 50 countries along the side Atlantic to sign the same treaty. And so therefore, this kind of leading states, superpowers or regional powers, they basically just cut the costs down and say, so for the time being, maybe we just stick with a more informal format and keep it lively with a couple of ministerial meetings each year, and then we'll see down the road. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes it endures over time, sometimes after a period of peak activity, it just goes into oblivion in history and no one really knows more about them. So I think that's what we can expect for this kind of experiments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We now have reached the end of this panel. We will not do any break, just change the table, and I will briefly introduce our guest of honor to speak today. But please thank the speakers of this panel.